Hello there. My name is John David Mann, and I am the author of a swath of books, one of which is The Go-Giver, and there's a series of Go-Giver books. And on the other end of the spectrum, from short to long, is the thriller Steel Fear, which I wrote with former Navy SEAL Brandon Webb. The Go-Giver is with current sales coach and teacher and speaker extraordinaire Bob Berg, and a bunch of books in between, which maybe we'll talk about. And the best advice I ever got was a teacher who said basically this. He said, "This is good, what you did. This is good, but it could be better." And with that, since I could be better with Phil with me, here it is.
That's a great segue. I love that, John. Thank you, man. And I love that you showed Bob's book and your book, because that is one of my favorites, right? I think that's actually how I was brought into your universe with the Go-Giver many years ago. Maybe it was something else. I don't know, but it was no, it's not. No, that's not true. I signed up for your newsletter 100 years ago before I even knew that you were working with Bob. That's how I met you.
Really?
Yeah,
wow.
For sure. Yeah.
Oh man, you go way back. Far.
Yep, I do.
That's so cool.
Well, I worked at 800 CO Read for a while. So you were the guy, right? You wrote memoirs and stuff like that. And I was like, ooh, this guy's interesting. I think at the time, didn't you have a TypePad blog, if memory serves?
WordPress, but yeah.
Early though.
Early blog. Not as early as Neil Gaiman, but still pretty early.
Yeah. Or Chris Brogan, right? So Neil Gaiman and Chris Brogan, first two bloggers that we all know, right? Famous guys. Chris
back in the 1600s. Yeah. Really?
Yeah, Chris removed himself from Facebook and Instagram. But he's still everywhere else. So, but yeah. Cool, man. So that's really solid advice. And that makes me laugh, because your book that you didn't share, because it's not really physical, but it kind of is. You showed me is, how to write good, or at least gooder, which I think is really funny, right? And I say that because most people say, well, you want to write great. But why good, John? Why is good?
Because, I can't, it's like, how do you write a masterpiece? Well, first of all, if you're going to try to write a masterpiece, you're frozen from the start. I can't write. How do you write something excellent? I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to sit down and make something phenomenal. I don't know how to sit down and write a paragraph that is so powerful it will make you weep and then make you go, oh my God, my life has changed. I don't know how to do that. Here's what I know how to do. I know how to write an okay paragraph and then come back to it tomorrow and make it better. I know how to take an idea and get the rough of it on paper, which actually may be pretty crappy. And honestly, often it is. I'm not being modest. The first thing I write down when I'm working on a project, whether it's a blog post or it's a parable or it's a full-fledged big nonfiction or fiction book, the first drafts of anything will tend to be pretty bad, or at least not so great. And then they require work. They require improvement. I need to winnow away the stuff that's not necessary. I need to find a better word, a better way of saying that, a better way of focusing that point. I need to look into this paragraph and say, okay, I get all this, but what am I really trying to say? Because I'm kind of talking around the point, not quite nailing it. And then I need to sand away this stuff. The whole famous thing about Michelangelo and the David statue, just carving away all the part of the statue that isn't David. It's like that. There's a great idea in there, but it takes whittling and sanding and chopping and chiseling to get to it. So it's like, if my goal is to write great, I don't know about that. But if my goal is to write good, and then a little gooder, and keep striving every day. I like the old Lexus slogan, the pursuit of excellence, the endless pursuit of excellence. It's the pursuit. The pursuit is what lands you in something that's going to really click for people and have an impact.
That's interesting. But Tom Peters wrote In Search of Excellence. So maybe your next book maybe you should retitle yours to In Pursuit of Excellence.
Yeah,
because I think that's what the writing is all about. To your point, we have an engine, if you will, right? To your Lexus analogy.
Yes.
And now we have to craft the car around it. We have to craft this story around it. That's really interesting to me to hear you say that, because I have to tell you, reading your work, I always feel like it's beyond good. I mean, truly, John, and I don't say that to flatter you. I mean it, man. I read your stuff, as I said, I know that I've read newsletters from you way back when they were just text.
Yeah.
To now, when you gave away the book, and I don't know if you threw away your list or if I somehow was subscribed with my other email address or something, but I'm like, oh, here's John again, which is great. But it's so interesting. So how do you find that central core message? I mean, like for the Go Giver, right? I mean, the Go Giver's central message is really it's the antithesis of most people's sales journey. It is not about service at all in sales, and yet somehow that is really what this book is all about with Pindar and all of this. So how do you find that? How do you find that nugget, and then how do you build the car around it?
Well, first of all, a couple parts to an answer to that. First is thank you very kindly for the nice things you said about my writing, and just to kind of prove my point. In that book, How to Write Good, which does exist, albeit not physically. It's an ebook. It's a free download on my site. But in that book, I devote a whole chapter to the first page of the Go Giver. Excuse me. And I show you the first page in our first draft. I offer that as proof that my first drafts are often crappy, because frankly, it's not that good. It's actually pretty bad. And then I walk you through the steps that we took to take that initial draft through to the final draft in the published book. And the published book has sold over 1 million copies. So it must have struck a chord at least somewhere, with you clearly, and with a few others. But if that initial draft, if the whole book had been like that initial draft, we wouldn't be having this conversation, because you wouldn't know about me, because nobody would have read the book. A few hundred people, and boom, it's over. I just say that to underline the point that I'm serious about this pursuit, the gooder part, the at least gooder, because that's where, I started out as a cellist, and my early experience of learning how to start crappy and get good is on the cello. And anyone who's ever had a child who picked up a string instrument or an oboe or a trumpet knows from bitter personal experience that the initial sounds that come out aren't so sweet. And it was no different for me. Starting from that initial terrible squawking and scratching to a point where you can really do something moving and profound with a cello, it's a little bit of incremental improvement every day. And it sounds terrible for a while, and then it sounds okay, and then it sounds good, and then it sounds sublime. And that's the path of writing. That's the path of the pursuit of perfection. So how do you find that? I will say this, that often, like you said, what's the Go Giver about? There's this core idea of what the Go Giver is about, which is that when you put your focus on the other person rather than on yourself, when you shift your focus from what you can get out of a situation to what you can offer to a situation, then your life gets better. It's not just that you have a better impact. It's not just that you serve more people. It's also that your life gets better. It's a pragmatically positive way to live, not just a noble and generous way to live. Well, we had that idea. Bob and I both knew that was the idea of the book, but how do you tell that? Because, that was a paragraph, and we could just try to publish a paragraph and say, hey, everybody, here's the paragraph. Now get it. People would not get it. People learn through stories. People learn through stories because stories wrap concepts and ideas and experiences around people, and therefore we can relate to them. They can relate to them because they're emotional. People learn through emotion. They don't learn through intellect. People exercise their understanding through intellect, and they process it through their intellect, but they don't absorb it through their intellect. They absorb it through how they feel. People absorb through their skin, through their feeling. So, every great speaker, even every moderately good speaker, knows that if you want to reach your audience, you tell great stories. right? That's how you give a talk. You don't start a talk saying, my father went to school in Germany, between the two wars of the 20th century, and very old traditional school, a school founded by Martin Luther. I mean, pretty traditional. And he says he remembers one day his professor standing up in front of the class and saying, "At this point in the syllabus, I am accustomed to telling the following joke." And I think the whole experience was about as spontaneous as that. So you can stand up before people and say, "I'd like to convey to you the following principles. Today we'll be talking about X and Y, and furthermore, if we have time, Z." And it's like, but if you stand up in front of the group and say, "It was the most terrifying experience of my life. A man walked up to me and said, pointed a gun in my face and said, 'Give me your wallet or you're dead.'" Or, whatever the story is. It could be the story. The story could be, "I looked at my kid and realized I was watching him grow up on videotape, on video camera, because I never had time to be with him when he was awake because I was at work all day." Whatever the story is that reaches your audience, it's stories that reach people. It's stories that teach people. If you want to reach, you've got to teach. If you want to touch, you've got to teach. If you want to teach, you've got to touch, is what I meant to say. So Bob and I had to find sort of the story of the Go-Giver. What's the transformation? What's Joe's transformation from where he starts to where he ends up? And that's true in any book. What's the journey? It's the journey. It's the arc of the story. I contend that any writing, from a novel to a blog post to a LinkedIn article to an email, really, like a tweet if you want to get crazy, basically any communication is a story of some form. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It has an arc to it, because you're taking the person you're talking to on a journey. It's like the most crass, mundane example I can think of, which salespeople may be familiar with, is the old feel, felt, found, right? I know somebody gives you an objection. That seems awfully expensive to me. You say, "Yeah, I know how you feel. I felt that way myself, but here's what I found, Bob." I mean, yeah, it's formulaic and cliched in the extreme, but it has the virtue of being a journey. It's like, there's a story to it. I promise you, I will never write a story that says feel, felt, found in it, but still, everything that you write is a story. And so it's a question of finding the story and following the story. It's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
So is that true in a memoir and a nonfiction book, and in Steel Fear, right? So
yes,
was that the goal there? I mean, you had a paragraph that you expounded upon into 400 pages, right? I mean, is that what you did there as well? Is that how that works?
460, if you want to. But anyway, yeah. I mean, basically, yes. It's, although I'm going to take what you said and just kind of normalize it a little bit. First of all, yeah, I've written some memoirs, and I've written some nonfiction books. A nonfiction book, I'm by that I mean basically a book about some ideas, right? So a book like Flash Foresight is a book with Dan Burris. It's a book about how to anticipate what's going to happen in the future and use that to your advantage in the present. So it's a how-to book. It's an idea book. It's a concept book. It's not a book about Dan's life. It doesn't tell his story. I've written a bunch of those nonfiction books. I've written a bunch of memoirs, another person's life story. And of course, obviously, a bunch of parables, the Go-Giver books and Out of the Maze and Latte Factor and a bunch of others. And now a thriller. They're all stories in the same way. And so when you write a memoir, you're not making the story up. I mean, you're not fabricating it. It's all things that really happened, but you still have to find the story. It's like you sit down with someone like, I did Brandon Webb, my Navy SEAL buddy. I did his memoir. It's called The Red Circle. It was the first book we did together. And I had to sit down with Brandon and have him basically tell me his life story from A to Z. We do it in like 45-minute or 1-hour phone conversations, which we did over the course of months. I record them, get them transcribed, and then pour through the transcripts. And that was kind of the raw material for starting. But I had to sort through that and say, okay, what's the story here? You know, what's interesting to the reader? What starts here starts with challenge and goes to triumph, or starts with a failure and goes to triumph, or goes from an aspiration and a dream and goes through obstacles and winds up in, you know, some kind of surprising conclusion. In How to Write Good, I say that you could describe the arc of a story this way: things get complicated, then they get simple, the end. That's basically a story. But you have to find, what's the starting point? So if you're writing a nonfiction book, like say you're in real estate, or you're in financial consulting, or you're in taxidermy, or you're in flower arranging, and you're writing a book about what you do, you're still looking for a story, an arc in that book. I'll give you a good example. Malcolm Gladwell, who's one of the most popular nonfiction writers, one of my favorites. You know, he writes books like The Tipping Point or Blink, you know, which is kind of about how we understand things without thinking. Tipping Point is about how little things can make a big difference. What the Dog Saw. He has all these different books that are basically the story of a single idea. And what Gladwell's so masterful at is he takes this idea, he knows what he's going to write about, and he tells the story of the idea. And he does it by lots of examples and vignettes and you know, profiles of real stories. And he tells them beautifully. It's like tons of little tiny memoirs all adding up to how he kind of found this idea and how we can understand that idea and what it means and how it works and how we can use it in our lives. It's just magnificent. But it grips you because it's like reading a detective story. It's like reading a mystery or something. Everything is like that. But then you said, is it like Go Giver? You take a paragraph and then figure out how to. For me, the process is messier than I'm making it sound, because it isn't usually like with the Steel Fear. It isn't like we take the basic idea and we know what we're saying and then spill the story out of that. To me, I often don't know what I'm trying to say. I'll start, you know, somewhere with an idea, with a situation, with a character, but I'm not really sure where we're going. And I'll give you an example. The Go Giver, we knew the basic idea. It's the one I said about putting other people's interests first. We kind of knew that. That was there in the title. Instead of being a go-getter, you're a go-giver. Well, what does that mean? Somebody who is actively giving. Well, what does that mean? We kind of knew. But the Go Giver is based on these 5 laws of stratospheric success, and we didn't know that. We didn't know what those 5 laws were. We didn't even know we were going to have 5 laws. I have this thing about the number 5 in the pentatonic scale, and it kind of goes back to my musical background, and it goes back to my study of Chinese philosophy. And it's like, I got this thing about the number 5. So when I started working with Bob's basic idea, he had this idea for the Go Giver. And he had the Pindar character, although not his name yet. And he had the Joe character. He had his name. I thought it was because like ordinary Joe, but now I think it's because Bob likes coffee so much. So he called him Joe. Anyway, we had Joe, we had this mentor, this character, and a few other ideas. The restaurateur he had. But we had no idea where the story went. And as I started kind of messing with it, I had the idea that there'd be 5 principles, but we didn't know what they were going to be. So often writing is a messy process of exploring and discovering. And that's why it's crappy when you start. It's because you don't know what you're doing. You know, it's kind of like most things you do. You don't really know what you're doing when you start. So with Steel Fear, Brandon had this idea for the story. And should I describe how this happened?
Yes, please.
So Brandon, before he was a Navy SEAL, he was in the Navy first for a few years. He was a rescue swimmer and helicopter sonar operator, and he was on a 6-month deployment on the aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is what you see up here at the top of the cover of the book. And that's a real ship. I spent some time on that ship. He spent 6 months on the ship. And this is back in 1995. They had just begun integrating women into their combat troops on naval vessels. So female pilots, female fighter pilots flying, what was that? Not Hornets. It was whatever the F-14 was. F-14, yeah. And a Tomcat, that's it, F-14 Tomcat. So they had female pilots, and they had female helicopter pilots, and they had women staffing the ship. And it was a challenge. Like, how do you integrate women on this close confined quarters for 6 months? With almost no relief from the outside world. And in the Navy on a ship, it's like no fraternizing. So it's a really challenging deal. And so they were going through that culture shift. And there was a sexual predator on board. It was this weird thing where there was this guy, presumably a guy, who would sneak into the women's shower area and flip off the lights and go in and molest somebody and then run, And it was understandably freaking people out. It kind of cast this sort of pall of terror over the ship for the women and the men, for everybody. It was creepy beyond belief. They never caught the guy. And Brandon thought at the time, man, what if these were murders? And that was the seed of the book. So here was the idea. There's a serial killer on an aircraft carrier. That's the whole idea. And that was his seed for his book in 1995, which he brought me 20 years later, 25 years later, 2009, in one of our first conversations. He said, would you ever be interested in writing a novel with me? I was like, I just put out The Go-Giver a year earlier, and I was writing a couple of memoirs, and I was, business, and I was all about personal development and leadership and nice, sweet things. And it's like, oh, a novel about a serial killer? Why would I want to do that? Hell yeah, of course I do. So it took me a decade to figure out why I'd wanted to do that, but I did. So we had no idea who is the hero of the book. And I spent years thinking about that. Who's after this? Who's going to be the guy that we follow? Who's going to be the person that we follow? And I ended up with two characters. One is loosely based on a female helicopter that Brandon knew at that time on the Lincoln, whose name was Mona, and we called her Monica. And the other character's name is Finn. No last name, apparently. Finn, like Huck Finn. And Finn is the stranger in town figure that you see in a lot of Westerns, right? He's this lone Navy SEAL with a cloudy past who's been dropped onto the ship at the beginning of the book, and no one knows why. And come to find out, he's not even sure himself why. And in fact, he has some memory issues. There's no spoilers, I think, if I just go ahead and say that. He's got some issues with his memory, and he's just come from a mission that has gone horribly wrong. And so finding the character of Finn it was kind of like finding the character of Pindar in The Go-Giver. It's like once we had Pindar figured out, and once he had a name, the book's engine started to purr. And it was the same way with Steel Fear. Once we had Finn, not only did the story start to purr, but we realized this is going to be a series. This isn't just one book. So anyway, the point that I'm making is, and again, whether it's a novel or a parable or a memoir or a nonfiction book or an article or a blog post or even an email sometimes, I often don't know what I'm saying until I'm halfway into it, until I get into it. And I go, oh gosh, I got to go back to the beginning and rewrite this because this isn't what I meant to say. What I thought I was saying is this. Here's what I really want to say.
That's interesting. So is your advice get started?
Yes.
Get going and then go back and edit later? I mean, like Hemingway, wasn't it Hemingway who said, wasn't it like write drunk and edit sober or something like that?
That does sound like Hemingway. I would not be at all surprised.
I can't remember, but that was something like that. So
it could have been me. It could have been.
It could have been. Yeah, let's give that to you. Yeah.
Hemingway is always stealing from me, man. It's like what a.
I know, right?
But yeah, I am not only am I saying that, I'm going to emphasize it by banging my shoe like Nikita Khrushchev. I think one of the things that kills people's writing, that kills aspiring writers, and that stifles people's writing, is people will start to You know how in a romantic comedy, you'll see the guy or the woman sits down at a computer and starts to type out an email, and they go, "I just want to say I had a great time today." And they stop, and then they delete it all, and they start over again. "I really had a good," and delete it again. They say, "It was a pleasure meeting you today." "Oh, that sounds terrible," and they delete it. It's cute and it's funny in a romantic comedy, but it's not cute and funny in real life, because people do that with their writing. They try to edit while they're writing. They write a sentence or they write a paragraph and they say, "That's crap, that's garbage," and they erase it and they start over, and they erase it and they start over. Or they write a page and they go back to it that night or the next morning and say, "Oh, this is awful." And they crumple it up and they throw it away, and that's the end of it. You know the story about Carrie, Stephen King's first big novel? So Stephen King has this idea about a girl in high school, right? In the locker, and a girl with paranormal powers, he wrote this opening scene, and I don't know, 8 pages, or he wrote just the very beginnings of the thing, and he thought, shit, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what it's like to be a teenage girl. I've never been one. I don't know what I'm doing here, and he crumpled it up and he threw it in the trash. And as far as he was concerned, that was it. And his wife, Tabitha, was straightening up later, going through his room, and saw these crumpled up pages in the trash can, took them out and brushed off the ashes. He was a heavy smoker in those days, and straightened them out and read them and said, and she brought them to him and said, "This is good. You should do more of this." He said, "I don't know what I'm doing." At the time, he was a less than broke high school English teacher working at a laundromat on the midnight shift to try to make ends meet, and they were really barely rubbing 2 nickels together to try to make a fire to cook on. And he'd published a whole bunch of articles in men's magazines. They still did that in those days. That barely bought some groceries. And his wife said, "You should work on this." He said, "I don't know anything about teenage girls." She said, "I'll help you with that part. Just keep going." And so he did. And, when they sold the paperback rights, it was like $480,000 for the paperback. I mean, it was the beginning of a career for him, and it was the end of poverty for him. But it's because he had a nice separation between the process of drafting the idea and then coming back later and working on it. And that's so critical. It's important when you first write to just let it go, let it rip. Turn off your critical mind. Don't critique it at all. If you know it's crappy, pretend you don't. Pretend it's the best thing you've ever done. And that's kind of where you have to have the sort of the confidence of a teenager, confidence of a tipsy teenager, maybe even the drunk, right drunk. Then don't edit it, don't revise it, don't fix it, put it aside. And it may be for a few hours. It may be for a day, it may be for a week. Kind of depends on the size of the writing and how much time you need for the emotional distance. But you need to wait enough time so you have a little bit of emotional distance from the writing. Then go back to it and look at it and be really, really open to changing it. I mean, if I write a whole page of stuff one morning, there may be 3 sentences in there that go, "Oh, that's good. That works." And all the rest goes. But it's worth it because I got that. It's like sifting through a mud puddle for a gemstone. And that's, example again is that first page of The Go-Giver. If you look at it in that chapter, I think it's chapter 6 or chapter 5, anyway, in my book, you see that in that first page, that first drafted page, it's crappy. It's overwritten in many, many ways. But there's some good stuff in there. And it took us a couple of years from that draft to the finished book to find the story in the rubble. There were some good ideas in there, and there usually are in anything anybody writes, because everybody is a human being with human experience. So everybody, I think I can safely say this, everybody who is inclined to sit down and start writing something has something to say that is of value to other human beings. It's the process of how do you find it, get it onto a page, and then craft it in a way that resonates for other people.
How do we balance that though, John? When we have to, or at least we think we have to put something out weekly, monthly, daily, whatever, as an article. I mean, do we just let it rip and then go back and edit later and put it back together? I mean, because I'll tell you, I'm struggling with that right now, John. I'm really challenged by the fact that I feel like my writing sucks and I can't put anything out. Like I threw away my mailing list right now because I can't write. And so, what do you do with that? How do you balance those?
So let me back up a little bit from there. It's a great place to start. So let me just back up 5 feet and say the first thing is, and this should go without saying, but it must be said, if you have the aspiration to write and you want your writing to be good, if you even want your writing to be on the edge of great, you got to read. And you've got to read that writing. You got to read writing which is good on the edge of great or greater. You have to read great stuff. Don't read mediocre stuff. Read great stuff. It doesn't matter if it's in the exact same genre or theme or channel as what you're writing. For years, I wrote nonfiction and I read fiction. It doesn't matter. It's the quality of writing. It's the quality of the message, quality of the storytelling. So first off, read great stuff. Make that it's almost like doing exercise. It's your mental nutrition. But then for you, like you want to say put out a newsletter online, or you want to put something out to your email list, let's say once a week. What I recommend then is, and I do this because I have found that for me, I can put out a blog post once every 2 weeks. For a couple of years, I was doing it weekly. And before that, I was trying to do it more than once a week. And I couldn't do it. But I can do every 2 weeks. And for a year or two, I did every week. For me, if I'm going to put a blog post out next Tuesday, I know that Thursday or Friday, I need to start. And I'm going to start by just thinking about the idea and getting some rough ideas on paper. And they will not necessarily be the beginning of the piece. They'll be somewhere in the middle. Maybe I'll think about an experience that I had that maybe relates to this point, and I'll write down a few words that remind me of that experience I had as a high school student or something. And then I have a couple of lines of thoughts, and I'll just get something down that's kind of like pointers or clues or beginnings. And maybe I'll draft a paragraph or two. But then I'll go back to it later. And later might be tomorrow morning. It might be tonight. Again, the time scale depends on your needs and your situation. But I do think it's really important to break the writing, break the finished piece into several steps. And one of those steps is going to be drafting. One of those steps is going to be fleshing out. And the third step is going to be finalizing, like finishing. And you don't want to leave out any of those three steps. If you try to flesh it out while you're drafting it, for me, I can't do that because I don't know where I'm going often. It's in the fleshing out that I discover where I was going. Drafting is just like tapping into my brain, tapping into the ether, doing something. It's like very right brain. It's very non-sequential. It's very intuitive. You could call it creative. It is definitely messy. So that's the drafting part, and it's a mess, and it's weird, and I would never show what I have on paper to anybody, not even my wife, because it's like, what does that mean? Then the fleshing out of that, I take the idea and say, no, where could I go with that? And that's where I say, oh, I see, I'm not going here, I'm going over there. Or I'll often find out that when I had my first drafting ideas, this used to happen to me a lot. I used to do a monthly article for a magazine. It was like the closing editorial, an op-ed piece at the last page. I had 400 words. And I'd often draft it, and I'd have like 500-600 words, and it would be kind of a mess, and it wasn't elegant, and I didn't know how to finish it, and something was wrong. And I show it to a friend of mine. He would say, "Oh, you got two ideas here." Oh, I was trying to say two different things. I was trying to make 2 points, and really I should just make one of them because one is a good article. And so I would literally take half of the piece, cut it off, put it off in a file, and just take these 200 words and go, oh, that's the article. And then say, well, how do I flesh that out? Sometimes that happens where you have a whole chunk that you thought you wanted to say, and it's not appropriate to this article. So that's the fleshing out part, where you start to get to know what your first thought was, and you start to figure out what it really should be, and you fill it out. And at that point, you can't be thinking, should I end this with a comma or a semicolon, or is this too many? What's the word count? You can't be thinking those technical details, because you snuff the life out of it. You need to just be thinking, what's kind of my narrative here? What's the story? What's it feel like? Then step 3 is finishing it. And that's where you say, okay, piece is done, but it's kind of rough. Now, it's like I finished building this table, but now I have to sandpaper it. And now I have to, shave it off, and I have to shellac it. And so that's where you say, well, is this the best verb is here? Is this the best? Should that big sentence be 2 sentences? Is this paragraph too long? Should I cut it in 3? Or are these too short? Should I chunk them together? That's where you start to finish the whole thing and give it the best possible form. That's like brushing your hair, buttoning up your shirt, and getting yourself ready to go outside. Wow. Hope that makes sense.
It does. No, and that's super helpful, right? So reading great writers, not mediocre ones, I think that's great advice to start, right? Yeah. To get the brain working and to understand what great writing is, and then drafting it out, fleshing it out, and finishing it up. Yes. I think are 3 great steps. Yeah. Right. And then the whole being willing to cut out half of it and maybe set it aside for later, because maybe it's too many points in that article, too many points in that
or the
chapter,
wrong point.
Or the wrong point. Yep. I really, really like that, John. And I think that's a great place for folks to get started and to get moving here, right? If you're stuck, if you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm never going to write as well as John David Mann, I will tell you, I certainly suffer with that. But the goal is not. It is to write good and then write gooder.
At least really gooder.
Like that. Yeah, at least gooder, right?
And I'll be honest with you, I suffer from the same thing. It's like I also think I wish I could write as good as John David Mann. I mean, and what I mean by that is, it's like right now I'm writing the sequel to Steel Fear, and I look at Steel Fear and I go, holy crap, that's really good. And it's not just the result of my writing; it's the result of a fantastic editor and a brilliant agent who also was an amazing editor, and a lot of readers for their input, and Brandon, my co-author, and all his input. But the book is really good. It's like The Go-Giver. I look at The Go-Giver and say, wow, writing a sequel to that is incredibly intimidating to me, because I go like, how could I don't think I can do that again. And I don't think I could do that again. Here's the funny thing. I can, but I don't think I can. And so it's, you got those 3 pieces beautifully. It's the drafting, the fleshing out, the finishing. What I want to say about those is, they're very different mindsets in the first part and the third part. The mindset of the first part is you have to forget about everything. Forget about somebody else's writing you admire. Forget about what people are going to think. Forget about what you're going to think. Forget about anything. This is like the right drunk place. This is like get rid of all your inhibitions. Write sloppy, overwrite, do purple prose, write insane, use curse words if they come in your mind. Write anything, whatever you think, write it. I mean, dare yourself. Say, no, I couldn't write that. Oh, go ahead and do it. Write. And don't look back until tonight or till tomorrow. When you're finishing a piece, it's the opposite mindset. The finishing is where you're completely sober. And when you say, is that really the best verb we could use? And you're really being objective. And it's like, I spent over 10 years as an editor, as a paid professional editor, editing other people's stuff, which is great training, because you're not emotionally attached to somebody else's stuff. It's not your stuff. You have to finish your own stuff in that mindset. It's like somebody else wrote it. You have to look at it and say, what was this guy Phil trying to say? Can we find a better noun? Can we find, is that too many? Could those adjectives be taken out? Could we just shorten that sentence? Could we say it better, cleaner, simpler? Mostly the rewriting process, mostly the finishing process is the process of subtraction. Mostly it's deleting words, saying things in a little bit tighter, a little cleaner, a little more condensed. The first finished draft of Steel Fear was 150,000 words. The published draft is 100,000 words. was like every third word had to go, basically. And when I was at 150, and our agent said, "Yeah, this is exciting. This is a good book, but you have to take it down to 100,000 words." I was like, "What?" That's like saying, "Oh, your child is very lovely, but you need to take off, a third of their body weight." I mean, how do you do that with it? I couldn't imagine it, but it got better and better and better with every 10,000 words that went. So,
wow. Well, I love that, John. That's a great place for us to wrap up today. So much more we could cover, but writing first and then forgetting what anyone else thinks, including you,
right,
is great advice for all of us, right? Get started.
Let it go.
Just write. Let it rip. I like that you even said challenge yourself to really write that piece, even if you don't think you can. I think that's really fun. That's a great way to consider this, because I'll tell you, I know I've been stuck, and I know people that I've talked to, they get, "Oh my gosh, I'm never going to be that good." But to hear you even say, "Boy, I wish I could be as good as John David Mann," in a non-ironic way, that's really helpful.
I have scenes in the book I'm writing right now. I'm writing the sequel to Steel Fear, and there are scenes in it. This happens in every book. There are scenes that are intimidating to me. It's like, oh, I'm going to just put that scene aside because I'm going to have to write that scene at some point, and I have no idea how to do it. It's like there's an action scene that's totally intimidating to me. And, at some point I have to sit down in the morning and have a cup of coffee and say, okay, we're going to write this scene. Let it rip. But it's like I have to do a drum roll, man, to get up for it.
Wow. That's awesome. That is awesome. Well, folks, if you're listening to this, if you're watching this and you're thinking, wow, I want to write Gooder too, the great news is John gives away his book, How to Write Good or At Least Gooder, on johndavidmann.com. So I encourage you, take a look, get to know John more. And John, where's your favorite social channel? If folks have questions, they have feedback, or maybe if they even picked up a copy of Steel Fear and said, holy crap, that's really good. Where would you tell them to go?
First off, there's my site, which you have on the screen, johndavidmann.com. I mean, that's if you hit the contact button and write an email, I'm the person that gets that. There's no staff that gets that. It's me. It all goes to me. So you can reach me there. And that's where I put, that's where my blog is. That's where all my books are. And there's a lot of information about every book. I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. I probably interact most on Twitter, but you can find me at any of them. I'm John David Mann, @ or / whatever is appropriate to that channel. It's Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. I'm on Clubhouse, but that's still experimental for me. So
there you go. Very good. Cool.
You're right. I'll answer.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, speaking of writing, get writing, friends. If you're listening, if you're watching, if you're thinking, oh, this is hard, here's the thing. John said, get started and go back and edit later. Don't worry about what anyone else thinks. So that's great advice for me. Hopefully that's great advice for you. And John, thank you for spending time with me today, man. It's great to see you. Thank you.
It is my pleasure. So great to see you, Phil. Thanks, man.
My pleasure.